Hey everyone, and welcome to my February reading wrap up. I had a really interesting reading month in February. At the start of the month I got off to a really good start. I think for the first week or so of the month I had finished a book for every day of the month that had passed. So it wasn't necessarily that I was completing a book every day, it could be that I was completing 2 books every 2 days, that kind of thing. I was reading a lot of poetry at the start of the month because of the Read a Theme Readathon, and their theme for the month was poetry. And this month I also took part in Lauren in the Book's Cozy Reading Night. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later on and a little bit in my favourites as well. So, seeing as I mentioned it, I might as well start with the poetry I read this month. So one of the poetry collections I read this month, which unfortunately I can't show you because I've lent it to a friend, was Katrina Naomi's The Way the Crocodile Taught Me. This is sort of a collection that is kind of a tragic comedy. It's about childhood and adolescence and family relationships. There's a sort of comically old-fashioned grandmother and an awful stepfather, but there is a lot of depth to those two characters as well. They aren't just the adjectives that I've used to describe them, you know, they have more depth than that. This collection is contemplative and reflective. It's full of realization, but it's also full of moments of humour. In this collection there's also a lot of interesting things done with form. I really enjoyed this collection, hence why I have passed it on to someone else. I was just like, you need to read this. The next poetry collection I read was Benjamin Zephaniah's Too Black, Too Strong, and I thought this was a really powerful and important collection. This is an explicitly political collection, and I love it for that. There is a lot of room for poetry that does just tell stories and allow you to draw your own meanings from them without being overtly political. But there's also a lot of room for a collection that is political at its core. In this collection, Benjamin Zephaniah looks at the struggles faced by minority groups in Britain today. He looks at discrimination and hatred and ignorance. I've marked a few of the poems that I particularly thought were powerful and important and well done. And they are Three Black Males, Naked, and Appeal Dismissed. They were the ones that really stood out to me. Another poetry collection I read this month was The Heavy Petting Zoo by Claire Pollard, and I was kind of disappointed by this collection. This has been on my radar for a really long time now, and I really am glad that I did get to it. This wasn't as powerful as I expected it to be. It is about being a young woman and sex and how you see yourself and how other people perceive you. It is about the transition from secondary school life to university life. It is sort of explicit and not for the faint-hearted. So you'd think from that description I would be all over this, but there was just something about the construction and the execution of these poems that it wasn't as good as I hoped it would be. There were definitely elements of this that I enjoyed. I really enjoyed the passion that comes through in Claire's writing, and I enjoyed it enough that I will definitely pick up more of her collections to see how her writing has progressed. The final poetry collection I read this month was The Princess Saves Herself in This One by Amanda Lovelace. I feel very similar about this as I felt about Milk and Honey, which I read last month, in that I think it is very accessible. I think it's worth reading. I think particularly if you're a young woman and you may enjoy the experience of reading this, and I would definitely recommend sitting down and doing it in one go and experiencing it as one sort of narrative. So this poetry collection is divided into 4 different parts: Princess, the Damsel, the Queen, and You. The first 3 sections piece together the life of the author, and the final section is a letter to the reader, or all of humankind. I just did feel very similarly to how I felt about Milk and Honey. I think some of it was really good and some of it really resonated with me and I found it relatable. But in terms of the poetry, I don't know how well executed or well crafted some of it was. Some of it did feel like sort of generic inspirational quotes chopped up with line breaks. In saying that, I think The Princess Saves Herself in this one did a lot of things that were interesting in terms of form compared to Milk and Honey. I think they're the type of poems that if I saw a picture of them on a Tumblr post or on an Instagram post, then I would probably reblog it or tap the like button, but it didn't blow me away for how it was crafted and constructed. The next book I read in February was a young adult book that is written in verse, and that was We Come Apart by Sarah Crossan and Brian Conahan. I really wanted to like this book. but I didn't. It was engaging enough that I was able to fly through it, and you know, it being written in verse definitely helped me read through it quickly, but I had a lot of problems with it. I'll get to those in a sec, but first I'll tell you a little bit about the plot. So there are two main characters and points of view in this book. The first of those is Jess, who is a very troubled teen. She has a lot of difficulties at home. The second of our protagonists is Niku, who is a young man who has emigrated from Romania. He's sort of struggling to find his place in his new community. These two teens come together under unlikely circumstances, and a romance forms between the two of them. Right, okay, the problems I had with this. One, I didn't understand why it was written in verse. I get that that is Sarah Crossan's own particular sort of way of writing, and she's really, really good at it. Like, I really enjoyed it in one. I don't know how Brian Conahan's novels have been written in the past, but I just don't think it brought anything new to the table in the way it did with one. I understood why one was written in verse. Secondly, I thought the portrayal of Niku and Romanian culture was pretty problematic. I think what they intended with this book was to show that despite Niku having broken English, you are still able to understand him. Despite some things getting slightly lost in translation, you are still able to understand what he says, and you can understand what he means to say. But there was no sort of progression with his standard of English, apart from him picking up a bit of British slang. That didn't really make sense to me, and also I feel like some of the ways he thought about things made him come across as not very intelligent. I didn't believe that that is something that someone would actually think. There was just something that didn't sit right with me about his portrayal. Yeah, this was a really disappointing read for me, actually. I felt like this book had so much good intent. I feel like they really wanted to show how brilliant immigrants can be and how they are human like everyone else. They shouldn't be othered, but I don't think they achieved that because it's so clearly not an Own Voices book. In February, I also did a buddy read. I did a buddy read with Katie from Books and Things, and I will link her channel down below in the description. And together we read All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. This book is about two characters, a blind French girl and a German boy, whose paths collide in occupied France as they both try and survive through World War II. It took me a while to really get into this book. For a while, I didn't really connect at all with Marie-Laure, the French girl. I was much more interested in Werner, the German boy who is a member of Hitler Youth. I found that aspect of the story a lot more interesting for quite a while. I felt a bit like there were too many things going on in this book. There is a subplot about like a precious jewel, and I'm not sure what that contributed to the book. I'm not sure why it was there. I feel like there were just a lot of bumps in the plot where I wasn't particularly interested in what was happening, but the writing and the language in this are a really strong point of the novel. I thought the writing was absolutely fantastic, and I loved how the sentences were constructed and crafted. The moment of convergence between the two characters was not how I expected it to happen when I began the novel, although as we got closer to it, it became a bit more obvious how these two characters were going to connect. Likewise, I found the ending a little bit predictable. So, as I've mentioned, the plot was definitely not the strong point of this novel, but the writing definitely was. As you may have heard me mention before, I am doing a writing sci-fi and fantasy module this semester at university, and I haven't really read that much sci-fi before. So I'm trying to delve into it a little bit more, and this month I read The Female Man by Joanna Russ. This is about what happens when 4 different alternative versions of the same person meet. The book plays around with gender roles and gender construction, and it deconstructs the gender binary, and they are all aspects of the novel that I really, really enjoyed and thought were really important and valuable. I think this was published in the mid-70s, and it feels so sort of ahead of its time and still so relevant. From the deeply embedded social constructions that it deals with to just little moments that I recognize from being relevant to my own life and my friends' lives. There's one little bit in particular which I'll find. 18-year-old male college freshman laying down the law at a party. If Marlowe had lived, he would have written very much better plays than Shakespeare's. Me, a 35-year-old professor of English, dazed with boredom. Gee, how clever you are to know about things that never happened. The freshman, bewildered. Huh? I just really appreciate that little section. My one difficulty with this book is that I feel like at points I struggled to work out what was going on. It was so sort of kind of a bit all over the place and experimental and complex that I didn't know what was happening. And that is a reflection of me. It's definitely not a reflection of the book. I just struggled a bit with the narrative style of it and how experimental it was. When I say it was all over the place, I don't mean that negatively. Like, it jumped around a lot. It was something I personally struggled to wrap my head around. But sci-fi in general, I just do struggle a little bit to wrap my head around. One book that I want to talk about really briefly, because it is a very short book, it's more of a collection of cartoons than anything else, is Big Mushy Happy Lump by Sarah Anderson. You may have seen some of Sarah's cartoons around the internet. I think the name she uses is Sarah Scribbles. And these are just a collection of cartoons that are very sort of relatable, particularly I think if you are a young woman. There are two sort of styles in this. There are sort of isolated individual cartoons, and there are ones that are part of a slightly longer discussion. So the cartoons will be accompanied by a paragraph of text. And I kind of just preferred the isolated ones. But yeah, if you get the chance, I would really recommend picking it up, because why not? The next book I want to talk about is Sophia Khan Is Not Obliged by You Sure Malik. This book is kind of sold as the Muslim Bridget Jones, and that's basically exactly what it is. There are so many similarities between this and Bridget Jones. Like, it is the Muslim Bridget Jones. Sort of style of writing it is very similar. I think the characters are very similar, and the plot is very similar. So in terms of like the plot of this book, it isn't the most exciting thing ever. If you have read Bridget Jones, it is like kind of the same thing. But I did learn so much about sort of Muslim culture and Muslim dating culture through this book, and I think that was a really valuable thing that I took from this book, and it really expanded my worldview. There are a lot of misconceptions and preconceptions that this book sort of broke down and dissected, and it really showed the realities and attitudes that exist around dating within the Muslim community. So for that reason, I definitely think it's worth picking up. But also, it is just a really enjoyable read in the same way that Bridget Jones is. It is a joy to read. It is easy to read. It is lovely to spend time with this character. I believe the sequel to this book is coming out in April. I definitely want to get around to reading that. It was a really enjoyable reading experience. Finally, I have two books from my 20th Century American Literature module. The first of those is Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms. And this isn't the most favourite book I've ever read by any means. This tells the story of Lieutenant Frederick Henry and how he deals with the hardships and difficulties that come with going to war and the aftermath of that as well. It also follows his relationship with a woman named Catherine. This explores and dissects the idea of falling in love during the war, and it also deconstructs sort of abstract ideas like bravery and courage and honor, these words that are so closely associated with war. And I thought that was really interesting, the idea of deconstructing these abstract concepts. What does it mean to be brave? What does it mean to have honor or pride? And I think his attitude towards the war is very interesting, and a lot of the aspects of this book and his attitudes towards the war are quite autobiographical. They are based on Hemingway's own experiences of war. But oh my god, I've never read a book that was so dripping in toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity is such an unfortunate thing, and it leads to so many difficulties for men. You know, this idea that men can't show emotion, that they can't be vulnerable. You can literally see that at work in this book. You can see how the character and how Hemingway hides his emotions and keeps them all packed in. And it's kind of sad to see. I think Hemingway was a really talented writer, and I actually quite enjoyed his writing style. But it's just not a book that I'm going to be thinking about for a very long time. And I don't know how much I sort of personally got out of it. And the final book I'm going to talk about is William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying. I got on with this book a lot better. So this book looks at the death and aftermath of a wife and mother named Addie Bundren. It is told through the perspective of her 5 children, her husband, other people that are just in their lives momentarily. Her dying wish was to be buried in Jefferson, Mississippi. And that is the task and journey that the characters in this book are given. They are going to great efforts to transport her body in a coffin to where she wants to be buried. I thought this book was so interesting in what it was saying about how you can tell the same story so many different ways dependent on who is narrating it and who is telling the story. This is discussing what it means to exist and whether you have an identity after death. This is just so interesting, and it is the perfect kind of university text in that my immediate reaction to reading this is like, I want to analyze this. I would just really recommend this book. And I am going to start writing an essay on this very soon. These are all of the books plus the ebooks that I read in February. It was a pretty decent reading month, I think, overall. Things definitely slowed down in the latter half of the month. But you know, that's okay. And I did have some disappointing reads, some books that I were slightly let down by. But again, that's okay. It happens sometimes. It's to be expected. I think I'm in a really nice reading position going into March. I'm not putting too much pressure on myself, which I think is good and healthy. Do let me know down below in the comments if you have read any of these books or if you're interested in reading any of these. I would love to have a little chat down there. The next time I talk to you guys will be in a few days for my February favourites, so I look forward to telling you all about my favourite stuff in February.